What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video just in time for Christmas. Merry Christmas to everyone who celebrates, and happy holidays. And for this video, we're going to be going through the breakdown of the recent Vampire format tournament that we held in the YGO from Zero Discord server. Link in the description down below if you want to join that for future tournaments. Next month's tournament should be in Chaos format, which should be a lot of fun. But before we dive into Chaos, we've got to cover what happened in this Vampire tournament. And in many ways, the results of this tournament were pretty expected, but in many other ways, there were some big surprises. So I'm excited to dive into it and talk about it with y'all. If you enjoy this sort of content, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. I release gameplay videos, I release breakdowns like this, I release a lot of good Retro Yu-Gi-Oh stuff, so if you're into Retro Yu-Gi-Oh, this is the place for you. Also, if you want to support me directly, then I do have a Patreon, links in the description down below, and I actually have two patrons that I want to shout out here, Rincewind and Bren Donker. Thank you so much for supporting me. If you join the Patreon, you will be shouted out in these videos as well, so that's incentive there, and there will be other perks like, being able to decide future video ideas and other things like that. I've got a poll on the Patreon for people who want to have a say in that, so head on over there if you want to sort of figure out what the perks will be. But with all that out of the way, let's dive in to this top cut breakdown. And before we get to the top cut breakdown, because the top cut was pretty interesting, I want to discuss the deck type representation here. Now, there were 27 people who joined this tournament, and of them, 16 of them brought Warrior Control, which makes a lot of sense because Warrior Control was the deck that won the last tournament. It's a very, very good deck in this format, and it's just like undisputedly tier 1. Other things may be tier 1, but there's still more testing is needed. So a lot of people brought Warrior Control. And the next highest deck in terms of representation was Science FDK. Now, Science FDK got second at the last Vampire format tournament, so it also makes sense that this was brought to the tournament. 5 people were on it, and none of them actually made it into the top cut, which I think may be a sign that Science FDK is not really that good. Maybe it's more of a rogue deck that can get lucky sometimes and manage to top a tournament occasionally. But it might not necessarily be, the best deck to play if you're bringing it to a tournament. Now, because it's maybe not as well looked upon for the next tournament, maybe it will be a sleeper hit and people will bring it and do well with it. It is a very tricky deck to pilot, so maybe there's also some things there, but I think a lot of it is just, it really does depend on luck. You can get hands that just do nothing and make you lose right away. So I don't necessarily think that it's the best deck in this format, but it is something that I anticipate people will continue trying to break and trying to bring in future events. And the other sort of people that brought stuff, it was just a mixed bag. There's one deck that's categorized as other because I guess it didn't fit into any other category. So I'm very curious what that deck was exactly. There's an Archfiend deck. There's a Reason Gate Turbo deck here. Zombie Stun, Empty Jar, and Zombie. So I guess, there's a distinction between Zombie Stun and Zombie. I think Zombie Stun is probably a deck playing Skill Drain as well as the Zombie stuff. And Zombie is just more just in on zombies, no skill drains, things like that. But I'm not quite sure. But still a very interesting layout of things here. Now, of course, the top cut was mainly Warrior Control. That had the highest sort of amount of players on it. But there were some surprise things that also made it into the top cut. There's also deck category representation here. I'm not the biggest fan of the tech category representation because I feel like at this stage in the game's history, the strategies themselves are more important than the actual types of decks they are. But this can be a good indication of like what a format plays like if you are interested in that sort of thing. Vampire format is rather control heavy, and you do see that here with control being the sort of most represented deck. However, I do think that it's also a bit more aggressive than other control heavy formats like Yada or Critter. I do think that like it's really tempo focused. You really do need to just keep bringing out monsters attacking into your opponent's life points every turn. If you can get a good tempo going, then you can often take control of the game and win. So I feel like this is more of an aggressive sort of control format, but the best way to figure out if you like this format or not is to try and play it, and you can do that in the YGO from Zero Discord server or in the Format Library Discord server as well. And this coverage does come from Format Library, so link to that will be in the description down below if you are interested in seeing more of that. But now that we've covered the sort of deck type representation and the deck category representation, let's dive in to the topping deck lists themselves. First up in the 9th place, and 9 because there was a tie in the top cut, normally it would be 8. Because of that tie, it became 9. But in ninth place, we have Colgate on Archfiends, and this deck is super sick. I showed off a version of Archfiends in one of my videos recently, and I do feel like, this deck confirms a lot of my suspicions that I had in testing the deck and playing the deck. 3 Deathstroke Archfiend, 3 Terra King Archfiend. That's the main core of this deck. Terra King gets destroyed, you bring back with Deathstroke. You got Pandemonium here to also search out a Deathstroke as well, to just keep your Terra King on field. It can be very annoying for your opponent to deal with. They're also playing the Marauding Captain strategy, which makes sense as Colgate was the one who originated the idea of, playing Marauding Captain and bringing out Terra King. So, I really do like this package. It also lets you play a bigger warrior package, and you can play like DD Warrior Ladies as well. Very, very strong package here. They're also playing Infernal Queen Archfiend. Now, I think there's a consequence of right before the event started, there was some confusion about whether Infernal Queen Archfiend had their, errated effect or unerrated effect. When Infernal Queen Archfiend was first released, there was actually, I'm not sure if it's a mistranslation, but basically the effect didn't say that, the attack gain fades at the end of the turn. So this card could just keep buffing itself up to very, very high numbers. So, I think this might be in there for that. I don't really think outside of that application this card is that good, but it did manage to make it to 9th place in this topping list. They're also playing an Archfiend Soldier as well. I think in the future here, though, we might see decks moving away from Archfiend Soldier and Infernal Queen Archfiend here, just relying on Marauding Captain, because Marauding Captain is a very efficient way to get out Terra King, and a very powerful way to do so as well. Also, something to note, 2 Pandemonium here, 2 Terraforming. I don't really like this ratio. I think Colgate themselves said that they weren't the biggest fan of this ratio after the fact, and they change in the future, like 2 Pandemonium, 1 Terraforming. But I do think that, it is important to have the Pandemoniums. It's not the best card in the world, but being able to keep access to Deathstroke Archfiend online is very, very important. But either way, I think this deck is really, really sick. I look forward to seeing it experimented with more in the future. I know that Colgate said that, after the tournament wrapped up, they put in a Sasuke Samurai to deal with things like Gravekeeper's Spy, and I think that is something this deck really needs to find a way to deal with, which is like Gravekeeper's Spy walling up Terra King Archfiend is really annoying for it. But very, very cool deck. And, I hope that people will experiment more with Archfiend in the future, given the success of this deck. Next up, we get into the Warrior Control list. And first up, we've got Clemexon's Warrior Control list here. Now, I'm not really going to spend too much time on these lists because they are largely the same overall. There's only so many ways you can build a Warrior Control strategy. But they basically all revolve around the fact that DD Warrior Lady is at 3 copies of this format and is very, very strong. So, you'll see triple DD Warrior Lady, double Rhoda, and, Exiled Force also in the Warrior package. And then beyond that, you'll see experimentation with things like Don Zalug or Zembire of the Dark, or maybe neither. Maybe just sticking with the Exiled Force DD Warrior Lady package here. But, these lists pretty standard. They all relatively look like this. So I'm not really going to dive too deep into it. The Magician of Faiths are cool here. Scientist is cool. Isn't always played in this deck, in the main at least. And same with Yada. There are some sort of flexible spots here. No Fiber Jar in the main as well is interesting to see, and we may have more to say about that later as well. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you're going to see a lot more of this sort of deck as we continue on in the video. Speaking of, here's Izuna Gaiden's Warrior Control deck that, managed to get basically the same spot as Clemexon's. Because at this point, these are all like the 5th place lists. They basically tie for 5th because they were knocked out in quarterfinals. But I'm not really the biggest fan of some of the things that this list is doing. I really don't like the Shining Angels in here because they can bring out Warrior Lady, true, but you already have enough access to Warrior Lady with things like Reinforcing the Army, and Shining Angels can get banished by your opponent's Warrior Lady. So I'm not the biggest fan of this, but I do think it is interesting to see it experimented with, and I'm curious to see if people will continue to experiment with this sort of thing in the future. I think if Don Zalug becomes more popular in these sorts of decks, then Shining Angel could see more play because you summon out Angel, crash into Zalug, bring out a Warrior Lady, and that's really good. But outside of that, I think that it's kind of a mid card here. We also have the Gravekeeper's Spies here, of course. Very, very powerful card in this format and really difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. So, I do think the Gravekeeper's Spy is an important inclusion in this deck, and happy to see it here. Moving on to Yomberman's Warrior Control list, and, again, pretty standard stuff overall. There is a Hades in here, which is a cool inclusion. With the Spies, you're able to get out monsters pretty easily, and then you can go for the Hades. So I don't think that's a bad inclusion by any means, but it is a bit bricky potentially, and maybe that's why they're, 5th instead of 3rd or 1st. But it is interesting to see that sort of experimented with, as Hades is a really powerful card. It shuts down things like Warrior Lady, it shuts down things like your opponent's Gravekeeper Spies. So I do think it is a very powerful tribute monster in this format, and I'm curious to see if it will see more inclusion in the future. Also important to note here, no Call of the Haunted in the trap slots. And I think this is actually a decent choice, because with all the DD Warrior Ladies running around, Call of the Haunted is a bit bricky sometimes. Now, there is a premature burial here, which you could argue is sort of a similar situation. But pre-mat, I guess you can activate on your turn. So it's more active. You can also use it to bring out like a Hades, or material for a Hades, that is. So it's kind of cool to see. But yeah, again, these are warrior control decks. There isn't really too much to distinguish them, besides these sort of neat sort of inclusions like Hades here. Next up for the last 5th place warrior control list, we've got GMYFS. And you'll notice that they're doing something similar to Yammerman. They've got the Hades here in addition to the Spies. Hades, again, very, very powerful card in this deck. They're also only playing 1 Reinforce the Army, which is kind of interesting to see here. Most decks do play 2, because having access to Warrior Lady is so powerful. But I guess, you gotta cut space somewhere, and I guess that was the card that got cut. Heavy Storm in here as well in the main, and also a Metamorphosis as well. Maybe using it with things like Scientist, as you can pay for Scientist, bring out something like a level 5 monster like Reaper on the Nightmare, and then use Metamorphosis to tribute out for like a Dark Balder or something, which isn't bad either. So kind of cool to see this experimentation here. Raigeki Break also in the trap lineup. Very, very powerful removal card. And again, as I mentioned earlier, tempo is very important in this format. So very, very cool to see how these warrior lists sort of all differ from each other in very subtle ways. But, again, these are going to be relatively the same thing with the Warrior Ladies, with the Exiled Force. Warrior Lady is just such a strong card, and having Rhoda to bring it out is such a powerful package. Moving on to the 3rd place deck lists, the ones that were knocked out in semifinals, we've got a very interesting list from Food here. This is a zombie deck, and Zombies is a deck that has a variety of problems in this format. DD Warrior Lady being able to banish things like Pyramid Turtle, like Vampire Lord, it's just really, really annoying for this deck to deal with, which is why a lot of zombie decks do use things like Skill Drain. Food opted not to do that, and went for a very, very low monster count, which is also kind of interesting here, but it clearly worked out for them, and they managed to make it to 3rd with this deck. Now, I will say that they have gone on record saying that the zombie package wasn't the best here, and things like the warrior package did sort of carry them a little bit. They would also potentially side out the zombie package, sometimes bring in like a scientist package with scientists and metas, and things like that. So it's debatable how much the zombies actually did here and how much of it was Food's own skill as a pilot. But still, seeing this deck do well shows that it can perform well in tournaments, and it's something for maybe more people to experiment with. So, I encourage people to try it out in many different forms. You don't just have to do the skill drain version that I showed off in a video. You can just do this sort of just more basic, Pyramid Turtle for Vampire Lord or Reaper or Patrician build. So very, very cool to see this deck in the top gut here, and shows that maybe this format, isn't quite as homogenous as people think. Next up for the other 3rd place deck, we've got Aratos' Warrior Control list. And again, just like the other Warrior Control list, this is pretty standard. There's a Book of Moon in the main deck, which is kind of cool to see. Book of Moon is a card that is legal at 3 copies in Vampire format, but doesn't see much experimentation because there are so many other powerful cards in this format. But it is a cool card, and when playing things like Magician of Faith, it can have value there. It can have value in many different ways. Also with Gravekeeper Spy as well, being able to set that down is very important too. So very, very cool list here from Aratos. Again, warrior control lists do a lot of the same stuff, but it's these sort of little tech choices that distinguish them that are interesting to sort of analyze. Now getting into the final 2 deck lists. First up in 2nd place, we got Declan here. Very, very good deck list here. And actually in Swiss, Declan went undefeated until they faced the winner of the big tournament. They lost that match, but then the finals was sort of a rematch between Declan and the winner of the tournament. So, very, very good player, very, very good deck. And this deck is just very cool. I mean, just as I mentioned before, it's warrior control. Not really too much to distinguish it from other things here. They are playing the Jinzo and the Yada in the main deck. They are playing Nobleman of Crossout in the main deck as well. I think Nobleman could definitely rise in popularity in the main deck, as it is a very, very powerful card that does get you tempo. Also, it stops things like Gravekeeper Spy, stop things like a set DD Warrior Lady. So that's potentially an option as well here. But yeah, very, very cool list. As I mentioned before, there isn't really too much to separate these warrior control lists. But I am very excited to dive in to the topping warrior control list of the tournament, which did do some other things slightly differently that we haven't actually seen in other warrior control lists so far. Lastly, we've got the winning warrior control list piloted by GBO. Very, very good duelists in this format. As I mentioned, they went undefeated in Swiss, and then they managed to win the top cut as well. But this deck looks really, really slick. I mean, again, warrior control doesn't really have too many differences between them, but there are some little tech options that I want to mention here. Firstly, no Fiber Jar. We saw this in some other lists that were in the top cut, but Fiber Jar is in the side deck here. I guess, for the going first matchup, it might not be as good. So you maybe want to bring it in going second. But I don't know. I think Fiber Jar is just a very, very powerful card, so I like to have it in the main. But clearly, GBO, you didn't really want it in the main, and it worked out for them. So maybe it's not a necessary main deck card in this format. We'll also see double Don's Luke here to search off the Rotas as well. I mentioned some other decks playing Don's Luke here, but here it apparently was very successful. We got Scientist in the main as well, very powerful card here, and we got Yada in the main too. And Yada locking did happen a fair amount in this tournament that we saw. Now, the other thing I want to mention about this deck that does set it apart is it's got triple Torrential Tribute and double Sakuretsu Armor. We've been mentioning how this format is very tempo heavy. Got to get aggressive. You got to sort of prevent your opponent from being able to take control of the game through tempo. And Sakuretsu Armor and Torrential Tribute are both ways to do that. So I do like these inclusions in the deck. I also think that with the main deck Yada, these are very good because you clear your opponent's board, get in with Yada, and they can't really do something to stop you that easily. Sakuretsu Armor is often overlooked in this format because there are just so many other powerful cards, but being a battle trap is just very important, as I mentioned, and so maybe after this, more people will be experimenting with Sakuretsu Armor in the future. Other than that, the one thing I want to mention is Mirage Knight in the side deck. This should be a meta inclusion going forward. Very, very powerful card. You can bring Dark Flare Knight off Scientist and then bring out Mirage Knight. It's just too broken. So I do think that this will be adapted by every deck in the future, maybe even in the main. But that's going to do it for my coverage of this format in this tournament. Or not in this format. I'm going to make more Vampire format videos. But for this specific tournament, this will likely be the last Vampire tournament for some time, at least held on my Discord server. Because we'll be moving into future tournaments. But I do think that this is a very interesting format. And while it may seem like it might be tier 0 right now, the success in this tournament of things like Zombie and Archfiend show that decks can make it to the top cut that are not warrior control. So I'm curious to see what people continue to bring in this tournament in the future. And I look forward to seeing how the format develops. But I hope that you enjoyed as always. Let me know what your thoughts are on this format and the tournament results down in the comments below. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero. I'm signing off.